Hey everybody, welcome once again to the Nerd Cave here, home of the Cult of Copy show, our weekly YouTube show slash podcast. And no, seriously, I promise this is the episode that it's going to turn into a podcast. Um, I'm your host, the Reverend Dr. Sir Colin D. Terrio, founder of the Cult of Copy, which, as I mentioned, is a large group of people. Currently, we meet on Facebook and talk about copywriting for marketing, persuasion, influence, all kinds of sneaky ways to make people do what you want them to do. Typically, that's, buy stuff. But sometimes you want them to, click a link or, wash the car or, bathe the dog, something like that. This episode, if you watched last week, we kind of did a dry run, a little test episode to sort of reboot the show because we had taken a long hiatus. And this episode is going to be the first of an ongoing series that may extend basically until I run out of different ones to talk about. It's going to be about cognitive biases and logical fallacies and what's called decision heuristics, errors in decision heuristics. And these are, if you're unfamiliar, cognitive biases are predictable ways that you think incorrectly and illogically based on flaws in sort of the old meat computers programming. Logical fallacies are very similar, although cognitive biases are flaws in thinking and logical fallacies are flaws in making arguments. And then errors in decision heuristics are basically ways that we are bad at calculating the things that we would need to make the right decision. Again, all based on the fact that your computer is a brain. Your brain is a computer made out of meat. So as you can imagine, it's not really, it's good. It's good enough, but it's not the best it could be when it comes to that. What gave me the idea for the overall series, exploring these different facets, was this guy. Let's see. Yeah, there you go. I'm holding it up to the camera for you guys who are listening on the audio. It's a book called You Are Not So Smart by a guy named David McRaney. And You Are Not So Smart is also a blog. So if you go to youarenotsosmart.com, you will get there. It's been around for a few years. He ended up doing a book. The book's kind of like a collection of his best essays, and he literally looks at the same thing, right? So I got the idea from him to look at logical fallacies and cognitive biases and decision heuristics. He does it from the standpoint of explaining to people, here's why you make bad decisions or other people make bad decisions. And it's sort of meant to be, you can do better if you're aware of these weaknesses. But this being the Cult of Copy and our mission being to get better at persuasion and influence, I decided I'm going to go to Wikipedia and get a big long list of cognitive biases and decision heuristics and logical fallacies. And we're going to go through them and talk about how you can take advantage of these flaws in the programming of the old meat computer and use them specifically to manipulate, is a word people don't like. So let's say convince people to do what you want. And this first episode is going to be about what's called confirmation bias. Now, before we get into the topic, I want to remind everybody that we do record the show live. So if you're watching this on the YouTube live streaming, right now as we're filming it, you can ask any questions you want in the feed there. Zane, my director, is in his own nerd cave somewhere, I imagine, on the console.
The space station floating above the Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. You're in the Cult of Copy's moon base.
Drop your questions. They're just to the right of the watch page. I even have a little comment here, just to let you know that it works. So I will field any and all questions. Just whenever Colin says, "Hey, we'll answer questions," if you got them, let me know.
Yeah, and feel free if someone asks something really good and I'm on a tear, feel free to butt in and interrupt me. But it is a live interactive show, at least when we record it. And for you guys listening to this as a recording at some point in the future, the current schedule is Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern is when we record new episodes, and we do it via YouTube. And you can get to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/cultofcopy if you want to subscribe and watch old episodes and pay attention to new ones. So now that we got all that trash out of the way, let's get into the topic at hand, which, like I said, is confirmation bias. And the reason I picked this cognitive bias is because it's really one of the most common ones, and you see it everywhere, literally all day, every day, all over the place, in media, in personal interactions, in a million small ways, in interacting with human beings throughout the day. Now, confirmation bias is the, let's call it a tendency to favor information that validates and, confirms your existing beliefs and conclusions and ideas and things. So hence confirmation bias. It's also called my side bias is another word for it you may have heard. The problem with confirmation bias, the reason it's bad is because you're kind of operating on incomplete information, because you tend to not only favor information that already backs up what you already believe, but you tend to ignore or reject any information that would contradict what you already believe, if you want to believe it. And generally, most people like to hold on to their beliefs about the way that the world works. I don't know where they originally got it from, but the guys who created NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which a lot of my audience will be familiar with, they talked about this thing called a concept, I guess you would call a concept, called the meta model of human thinking. And their idea was that people don't actually operate in the real world. They operate based on a very detailed simulation of the real world that exists in their head. Now, when people have things like a phobia, for example, what the problem really is that they are irrationally afraid of something that's not true in the real world. Like, you won't drown in the bathtub, like you don't have to be deathly afraid of, well, I guess some people do drown in a bathtub, not to be a downer. But generally speaking, you should not be like pants shitting terrified of taking a bath. But what happens in people who have a phobia of water, for example, their model in their mind does not match reality. So the actual real life likelihood of you drowning while taking a bath is very, very small. But in their mind, their model is flawed. So in their mind, it's much, much more likely, and they can't get around it. So there's lots and lots of stuff that has been written about therapy and hypnosis and NLP and persuasion about helping people adjust their meta model. Now, the whole reason I bring up that meta model thing is because it helps understand what cognitive bias is. Cognitive bias, to me, is the tendency of a person to want to preserve their meta model intact and not change it. So the information they consume has to validate that model and not contradict it, because it makes people really uncomfortable when they find something that shakes their internal world. And they only seek out information that supports it. Any information that's ambiguous, they will tend to interpret that information in a way that supports their beliefs. And then they will basically remember things incorrectly over time, more and more. The more they recall a memory over time, the more it will fall into complying with what they currently believe. And it's all very, very interesting, the way that your brain basically tricks you all day, every day, to get you to, go through the motions and live your life. So
we got a question from Paul here real quick.
Yes.
He's actually asking, I don't know if it ties in to what you're currently talking about, but Paul Wilson's asking, hi, Colin, what's the image behind you? The one behind your head, but I guess you could talk about both.
Oh, sure. Yeah. These are paintings by the one with the elfish gentleman with the beard is by Eric Stafford, who cultists will know. I've done a co-training with him on lead generation for copywriters. He's in the marketing world. And then this one just behind me is a painting of one of my personal heroes, Genghis Khan. That one was commissioned by Rob Cicadas, I think is how you pronounce his name. A lot of people who travel in the same circles as me would know him also. He does a lot of design work for some marketing stuff, but he's mostly an artist and paints paintings and murals and makes prints and does all that kind of stuff. But wizards and tyrants fit right in with a cult of copy kind of vibe. So
Yeah,
I
cool.
got I got
That was it.
some nice decoration for the office. No, it doesn't tie into the show though. To answer your question,
All right. Well,
so
that was my follow-up question. Paul was just mostly curious what they were. So
yeah, no, I appreciate it. For those listening to this in audio format only, at some point in the future, you should watch the video show and see my cool paintings that I have as a backdrop. Anyways, back to the topic at hand. Confirmation bias. One of the probably most influential, I guess, examples of commercial confirmation bias that you might see would be the various spin-centric 24-hour news networks, right? So your Fox News would be the right-wing conservative sort of confirmation bias engine. And I don't want to make people think I'm just like slagging on them. I think it's pretty genius the way that they serve their market segment with this confirmation bias engine, because like we said, there's bias in the choices people make for the information they take in, the sources of that information. They tend to only want to pick ones that support what they already believe. So if you find a news channel that only reconfirms and validates your existing beliefs and viewpoints, you're going to only watch that one. You won't watch any of the other ones. So it's built in ratings to do that. They also only interpret news and spin and give you the opinion that puts their particular point of view on it. So you're getting the news, which are just events that happened of their own accord, but they're contextualizing it. They're the ones interpreting what it means, what is going to happen subsequently to that, based on that worldview that they're continuing to confirm. And then, of course, the fact that this information has been contextualized specifically in this way means that people's memories of events are now shaped specifically by things that they've heard and consumed. And sometimes it can even be warped, because we'll probably talk about this in a future episode in this series, but scientists currently don't think that your memory works like a recording device. It's more of a playback machine, and unfortunately your recollections and your imagination in your brain are very close together. So when you remember something that happened, you're basically imagining stuff to fill in the gaps that you don't exactly remember. But then when you're done remembering it and you're saving it back to the old computer hard drive there, it has those imagined parts stuck in it. So the next time you recall it, you'll recall it with parts of it being imagined. So as you can think, as you might conclude, the confirmation bias over time it just continues to self-reinforce, because people are, like it's an old adage that people are creatures of habit, and it's especially true when it comes to our beliefs and the way that we see and think about the world. So now that we have an understanding of what confirmation bias is and the different ways that it can occur, including let's clarify them and say three different kinds of confirmation bias we're talking about specifically are the search for information being biased, meaning when you go looking for information to learn something, you favor sources that validate your current existing beliefs and viewpoint, and tend to reject or ignore sources that don't. So that's one, the biased search for information. The second one is confirmation bias when you interpret ambiguous events or occurrences. And the third one would be memory, when your recollections are influenced by your current beliefs and points of view. So looking at those three, how can we, as marketers and influencers and persuaders, harness this to our own end? So obviously, when we talk about like 24-hour news networks, you can learn a lot looking at the way those guys shape their audience's point of view. And if you're incapable of watching one of those networks objectively, like removing yourself from it and just sort of watching it to see what they do, try watching like the opposite one. So if you watch Fox News all the time, maybe you try watching CNN or MSNBC, or do it vice versa. But what you want to look for is, like I said, you want to look for what it is that they're giving you other than just the simple facts. So anytime they give you a reason why something happened, or a meaning, they attribute a meaning, they try to contextualize it, that's the opinion coming in, and they're basically using that ability to shape the facts to help their audience fit those things into their already existing belief system and worldview. And again, the reason they do that is because if you can make a news network that's 24 hours that only confirms people's existing beliefs, they're going to continue to pick that network over any other one, right? Because that's the way confirmation bias works. So using that same idea as a marketer, if you create a specific source of information, and I guess the current buzzword for that would be like curation, right? So if you have a particular niche of information that you operate in, whether it's fitness or business, or even me with copywriting and persuasion, you give it a particular twist so that you're presenting it in the way that a certain audience that you want to reach interprets it. So an example might be in the fitness world, you have guys that are like very focused on the weight training. And then you have another camp of people that are very focused only on like body weight exercises and diet. And they may have very divergent, very different ideas of what's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do based on what they want their results to be. But they're going to have a tendency to only want to seek out whatever source it is that's confirming and validating what it is they already believe about it. So if you create that channel of information that does that for them, you're going to create a preferential channel that they're going to want to dive into, other than looking around for other sources of information. If you can create that pure feed that's mirroring their own values and things back to them, that's where they're going to go, right? Because you're doing the hard work for them by putting the interpretation that inserts all of this troubling new discoveries into the worldview that they want to retain, right? So that's one way to do it. Another way you can do it is if, say, you're selling a product and you are selling it online, and the product hinges on a certain belief in the marketplace that something is important. So if you have like a product about doing, say, Facebook marketing a certain way, and that relies on maybe a particular interpretation of Facebook's rules, maybe. Like, I don't want to diss on Facebook. I'm just using them as an example. It could be anything. Substitute LinkedIn or Google. The idea is, if you know where your prospective audience is going to go looking for information as pertains to the product you sell, you can do things like, say, a saturation campaign where you try to get a bunch of search results ranked on different properties, different medias that support the idea that you're trying to put forward, so that when someone goes looking, it seems like everything confirms what you're saying, and therefore they accept it as their belief, and it's ironed out. So that's a way you can shape perception. It doesn't have to be like manipulating Google results. That's just one way that I know of that it can be done and is done. Another way you can do it is if you have an audience and you're trying to reinforce for them a certain point of view or a certain belief, you can create the illusion that this is an accepted and, basically set in stone belief by finding only the external sources that you can that confirm it, and then sharing those so that from their point of view, it looks like they're getting a wide variety of sources that confirm whatever it is that you want them to believe. But really, you're cherry picking only the ones that, agree and validate that particular belief. But from their point of view, it looks very diverse. Um, Cults do this, by the way, by controlling the sources of information. They can make it seem like whatever beliefs it is that the cult leader wants his group to believe, uh, those beliefs continue to be reinforced because they control that flow of information. It must be true because everything that I see validates what that guy is saying. So that's another way to do it, not just in cults, but like, I guess North Korea would be a good example because the state-run media controls all information that the people get, and they selectively only allow in information that confirms what it is that they want the people to believe and reject and ignore everything else. Basically, propagandists and cult leaders sort of act like your brain does when it comes to confirmation bias, but they do the selecting for you, is one way to look at it. So another way, looking at another type of confirmation bias, which is the interpretation bias. Another way that you can use this to your advantage is sort of what we were just talking about, not just with the sources of information, but if you have an audience and they rely on you for information in a particular topic, you do them a favor by giving them the interpretation that will fit it into their existing worldview and beliefs. Now, it used to be the old school idea of unbiased journalism was specifically about avoiding this kind of bias where you leave the interpretation up to the person. All you give them is the facts. And that if you do give an opinion or an interpretation, you mark it very clearly that this is the case, that it's editorial. Nowadays, they don't really do that. Like there's no separation between like unbiased journalism and opinion and spin, at least not in America where I live. But the reason those news networks like that are so successful is because like everybody wants to know what the meaning of something is. How do I contextualize this piece of information? How does it fit into my life? What am I like, where does it go? What does it mean? How does it inform my worldview? So if you do the heavy lifting for an audience and you just go ahead and tell them, you figure out how to explain it in a way that fits into their worldview, they're going to want to keep coming back because you're basically doing the busy work that their brain already wants to do for them. And sometimes if you're smart and clever, you're doing it in a way that they wouldn't be able to do themselves. So you're making them feel smart for believing the way that they do, even though they weren't able to think up that explanation for why it fits the way that it does. I wish I had thought of an example to maybe explain this if this seems confusing. Um, but really, like any kind of niche blogger that's like covering, say, the world of SEO, for example, and they take a particular approach, a particular view. So every little piece of info about SEO that is released from Google or Bing or gets on Twitter and a bunch of people tweeting about it, they weigh in and contextualize it with their point of view, and everybody that agrees with their philosophy is going to want to follow that particular source of information, right? That's what they're going to accept because they're more likely to believe the things that already fall in line with what they want to believe. An interesting thing that I saw earlier, I think it was last week, it's apparently a recent Stanford study talked about how they measured all the different ways you can try to get someone to change a political opinion or consider the opposite viewpoint. And the one that proved to be the most powerful was if you can line up that belief with the person's existing morals and values, which I thought it was funny that this was somehow like a new discovery of Stanford's, because I feel like copywriters have known that for ages and ages. That's very well known that you line up your desired activity with the prospect's sense of self, their identity, who they see themselves as, and they'll more likely comply with it. But I found that interesting as it relates to confirmation bias, because if you can take a piece of information that you have, like your audience might reject it or they be resistant to it, if you take it and try to interpret it in a way where it fits within their value system in their mind, then they're more willing to accept it. And because of the way confirmation bias works, once you get it in there where they're like, oh, okay, I can kind of see that, then it's become part of that internal structure. And you can continue to reinforce it through repeated confirmation bias because they're going to start remembering it wrong. And then what happens is because of that memory bias, people forget that they ever didn't believe that way. I forget what it's called. It's a completely different cognitive bias, but people have a tendency to feel like whatever it is they think and believe now, that they've always thought and believed that way. So like a lot of times people mistakenly think like the way they are now as an adult is the way they've always thought, even back to being a child. Because what happens is when you bring up that memory of being a child, you've reprocessed those thoughts so many times from your current point of view that you don't remember what you didn't know at the time you were a kid, right? Like your brain jettisons all of that because it doesn't fit with what you currently believe. So really using confirmation bias in this way with an audience where you have a repeat audience that's going to come back over and over again, it's really, really very powerful. And it's the kind of thing where it makes people more and more loyal and fanatic about your source of info. And it really cements in that worldview where it's very, very hard to crack. And I think, unfortunately, one of the side effects of that here in America is that it's created that adamant no sort of surrender, no compromise possible. I'm 100% right and you're 100% wrong, and that's all I will accept. Because they constantly pay attention to these confirmation bias machines that do it again and again and again. So like anyone who disagrees in any way with what that machine has conditioned them to reinforce and validate seems completely insane, because as far as they know, the entire universe is lined up behind confirming their beliefs. But it's because they don't realize they only have one little narrow source of information and they're only interpreting it in that one way. Ooh, look, we almost went the whole half hour. We just got a little bit left to go. So I'll wrap up and leave you with this. The thing with confirmation bias, how you can really put it to use for you, is to approach your audience and figure out what their values are. What do they currently believe? What do they accept about the way the world is? Even, and that your goal isn't to correct them. Your goal is to confirm it so that they line up with your source of information. And once you have them lined up that way, then you can start to, if you really care about changing people's lives and making it better and all that, you can do that in a secondary way once you already have them. But the way that you get them and get them to keep paying attention is by confirming their biases, because their brain really likes it when you do that work for them, because that's what their brain wants to do anyway. So I would say, let's call it a day. We've gone for 30 minutes, which is what I want to try and shoot for the new show length. Hopefully you like it. They're a little easier to get in and out of than the hour-long ones we used to do. I would love to hear from you in the coming week before we do our next episode, what your thoughts are on confirmation bias. So if you're a member of the Cult of Copy Facebook group, please do post maybe a comment in the thread about this show. I would love to continue the conversation there. If you're not a member of the group, you can join it by going to cultofcopy.com, which is currently a blog that we're working on launching. But if you click on, I think it's the top right-hand little menu link underneath the logo there, it says group. If you click there, it'll take you to the Facebook group where you can ask to join. We would love to have you if you happen to be listening to this and are not a member. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Confirmation Bias. This has been the Cult of Copy Show. New episodes recorded weekly, Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Look for us on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Cult of Copy, and soon to be a podcast. I'll have the URL for that once it actually exists. Thanks again, Zane, for joining us and keeping everything tight. If we don't have any questions, we can call it a day, buddy.